Well, hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Help My Business is Growing, a podcast where we explore how to grow and build a business that is healthy and sustainable. I'm your host, Kathy Svetina, a fractional CFO and a founder of Newcastle Finance, a company where we believe that everything that you do in your business is eventually going to end up in your finances, and to get to healthy finances is to have a healthy business. Well, the question is, how in the world do you get there? Well, this is where this podcast comes in to help. And today, this is such a treat episode for me because I am actually interviewing my business sales coach, Nikki Rausch. And we're going to be talking about Neuro-Linguistic Programming, or NLP for short. And I first actually heard about NLP when I hired a career coach a couple of years ago. And I didn't know truly how to actually implement that in my business. So when I found Nikki and saw that she is actually an NLP practitioner, I jumped on the bandwagon to be coached by her. So we're going to be talking about NLP. And NLP is a powerful tool for anyone that is looking to improve communication skills because it can help you grow your sales, but it also enhances interaction with your team, with your shareholders, with your stakeholders, suppliers, and even it's very useful in your personal life as well. So we're going to be talking about what exactly is NLP and how it can transform your approach to communication, how it can help your business grow, and what are the steps that you need to make to start using it effectively. And Nikki, as you will see in this episode, she is very practical. She gives a lot of great examples and things that you can actually start using right now in your next conversation, whether it would be on your sales call, with your employees, in your personal life. You can use this technique in your next conversation. And I am so excited to have her on this podcast. And before I give you a little bit of bio on Nikki, I want to give you a quick reminder that all of the episodes on this podcast, including this one, come with timestamps for topics that we discuss, and each one has its own blog post as well, too. You can find all the links and the detailed topics in the episode show notes. It is there for you as a resource, and please go ahead and use it whenever you feel like you need it. Again, my guest today is Nikki Rausch, and she integrates 25 plus years of experience selling to prestigious organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Hewlett-Packard, and NASA, sharing with her clients the same approaches that led to her shattering sales records in her industry and receiving multiple top producer awards along the way. A business degree from the University of Washington and her master's certification in Neuro-Linguistic Programming, NLP, mesh perfectly to create a powerful foundation upon which Nikki built tremendous sales skills and now provides enormous benefits for her clients. Nikki has received numerous sales awards, shattered sales records across industry, and was featured in Female Entrepreneur magazine. She's also a sought-after speaker, podcast host, and an author. This is going to be a great episode. Please join us. Nikki, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to get to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for being here. Nikki, for my listeners, is actually my sales coach. So we've known each other for, almost a year and a half at this point. Mm-hmm. We work together very closely. And she taught me a lot of good stuff, not just about sales, but, communication in general. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to have her on the show and share the knowledge that she has with the rest of you.
Well, I'm excited to share. And it's been my absolute honor and pleasure to get to support you in the last year and a half.
Oh, thank you so much, Nikki.
I'm a huge fan.
Oh. So one of the things that you've taught me is NLP, which is Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Yep. I hope I said that right. It's kind of a tongue twister.
It is.
And I think it's such an important thing to have in your toolbox as you are building a business. But let's talk about what is NLP exactly.
Yeah, so neuro-linguistic programming. So neuro is the way we process information in our brains. Linguistics is the language part. So how you speak to others, how others speak to you, and also any internal dialogue that you've got going on. I always say I have a few voices up there, but that might be a therapy session. And then the programming part is about habits and patterns. So it sounds super technical, right? Like processing information in your brains and language and patterns. But realistically, the most basic way to explain it is it's learning the art of communication and how to use that in a conversation to put the other person at ease, and also to how to be more effective in the way in which you communicate. So NLP is used around the world for all different types of applications. It's used for patient compliance. It's used, therapists use it. Obviously, sales professionals use it. All kinds of people use NLP for a lot of different things. But for me, it's about the communication piece of how can you communicate in a way that makes it easier for the other person to stay in conversation with you and for you to get to more of the heart of the matter versus always just talking at a very surface level.
That's really interesting. And how, if you're having a conversation, like for example, if you're having a sales conversation, using NLP, how would that be different from just a sales conversation that you would have if you didn't know NLP?
Well, there's a few techniques, and you might know of these for, hear about, like NLP techniques are often talk about, they talk about versions in psychology. They talk about versions of this in behavioral economics. But specifically in a sales conversation, one really easy technique, and by the way, all of the things I'm going to talk about, you can use in any conversation, right? Doesn't have to be just sales. But in particular is paying attention to somebody's rate of speech. And the reason this is important is because we all have a certain rate of speech. If you think about on a scale of like 0 to 10, there's people who talk really, really fast. Sometimes they don't even take breaths between their sentences. Mm-hmm. Like they've got that fast rate of speech. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have somebody who really takes their time when they're speaking. Now think about whatever your rate of speech is, like again, 0 to 10, wherever you fall, whatever number you'd assign yourself. How uncomfortable is it for you to be in a conversation with somebody who speaks at a very different rate than you? If you're somebody who has a slower rate of speech and you're talking to somebody who's a fast talker, oftentimes you might look at that person. If they're trying to sell to you, you might think, oh, they're slick, or they interrupt me constantly and step on what I'm trying to say. Now, on the flip side of it, if you're somebody who is talking to a really fast talker and you have a slower rate of speech and you're trying to earn that fast talker's business, for them, it might be painful to be in a conversation with you because it's always like, what are you trying to say? Like my brain is processing so fast and I'm like, what's going on here? So when you can adjust your rate of speech, for instance, in a conversation with somebody, specifically in sales, you make it easier for them to actually engage, and you also make it easier for them to process what you're saying. So when you want to earn somebody's business, it's important that they are actually being able to take in what the person is saying to them. It also gives them permission oftentimes to be more revealing about how to earn their business because they're more comfortable with you. Like think about somebody, if you just meet them for the first time and you instantly have that connection. Like you're like, oh, this person's so easy to talk to. Chances are you guys have very similar rates of speech. And when you meet somebody like that, it's like you can be talking to them for an hour and it feels like it's been like 5 minutes because it's just so comfortable.
Yep.
Right. And on the flip side, meet somebody who's very different style than you, and you instantly feel that like, oh, like kind of the ick factor. And you talk to them for 10 minutes and it feels like you've been talking to them for an hour and you need a nap, right? So adjusting your rate of speech sends the message like we can be in conversation. So either I can slow down or I can speed up a little bit. And I don't have to match you 100%. I just have to be willing to make some adjustments to make it more comfortable for you. Because the more comfortable you are in the conversation, the easier the conversation flows. So the other thing I'll say about this is when you meet people who you feel that connection with, the people who you're like, oh, I like this person, chances are there's something about that person that feels very similar to you. It's like we like people who are like us. But here's the real kicker. When you meet somebody who's like you think that person is smart because you're smart, right? And so don't you want to work with people who you feel comfortable talking to, who get you on a level that you're like, oh, it's better working with this person than working with some other salesperson who's just trying to like talk at me the whole time. So that's one example, rate of speech using NLP.
Would it be fair to say that you're projecting the energy back to what the person is giving you? Or are you trying to, basically you're trying to mimic them, but do it in such a way that it still feels comfortable for that person? Would that be the goal?
So yes, to a point, not mimic. I wouldn't use the word mimic because mimic feels like parroting and that feels awkward and weird. Yep. So in NLP, we call it matching and mirroring. And I teach this in sales. And I teach that the goal is you only have to match like 50 to 60% of somebody. So if you're matching rate of speech, if they're at an 8 and you're a 2, if you can speed yourself up to a 5, it makes it easier for them to be in conversation, right? So you don't mimic somebody, but there are things you can match and mirror besides just rate of speech. You can pay attention to the phrasing that they use, for instance, because words create pictures in our minds. And certain words create a certain picture, but I don't get to see into your brain. Like I don't get to see what picture you're forming. But if I pay attention to the words that you're using, for instance, here's an example of this, is I had a client who was a photographer. And she was telling me that her website attracted a certain type of clientele. And then she would get on the call with these, they would set up a discovery call, like a consult call with her. And then she would get on the call with them. And she was like, I could never close the sales. And I couldn't understand. I was getting all these leads from this certain type of group. And then we would get on a call and there would be this disconnect and I couldn't figure out what it was. So as I dug into her sales process and I started paying attention to the words, the one thing I asked her is, now this particular group of people that are showing up on your website often, how do they describe what it is that you deliver? So she's a photographer. So she talked about photography, photos, right? Photographs. And she said, well, they call them pictures. This group of people, they call them pictures. And I was like, so you need to call them pictures when you're talking to them because that word means something to this particular group of people. And you're still talking about the same thing, but every time you correct them and say photos, you're essentially saying like the way you speak is wrong. It's not. And you're creating a different picture in their brain because what picture brings up in their brain might look very different than what photo brings up in their brain. So paying attention to people's words is also so critical because words create pictures in our minds.
That's really interesting. And, you and I have done a similar exercise together because for full disclosure here, every discovery call that I have, I actually record it with my AI note taker. So it is so valuable to have those recordings because now I can go back and I can actually see the sales process and where I have failed to do that, the sales process just kind of fell apart.
Yeah. Because you can see sometimes where, and sometimes it's not even intentional on your part because like you have a thought, you create mental pictures and images in your brain. And sometimes, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, where somebody says something and you hear it totally different, but maybe it's played back different. And you're like, that's not what the person said. Well, it's recorded, so it's right there. This is actually what they said, but that's not what your brain heard. And so in a sales conversation, if you're not like turned on and tuned in and paying attention, sometimes we can create these disconnects between us and somebody else because we're taking what they're saying and we're applying what they mean to it versus actually what they said. And sometimes what somebody says and what they mean, you don't actually know what they mean. And don't assume that you do. We often do this in conversations, especially if we know somebody well. We're like, well, you said this, but what you really meant was that, right? But in a sales conversation, if you do that, then it just sounds like you're not paying attention to the other person or you're not speaking their language. It's kind of like, you go to a different country where they have a native language that's not English, and you walk in and you go like, hey, I speak English, so I'm only going to, frequent your restaurant or stay at your hotel if you can speak my language. Well, this is also why they think like, ugly Americans, right? Because we demand everybody be like us. You don't want to be like that in a sales conversation. You don't want to be the person who shows up in somebody else's country and tells them that their language is wrong or not as good as yours, because that's just not true.
And how do you train yourself to look for those opportunities? Because I will tell you, one of the hardest things is there's already a lot of stuff happening when you're communicating. You're trying to be an active listener. You're taking things in. And now there's another layer to it that you have to be paying attention to. I would assume, obviously, you get better with repetition and with practice. But what are some of the practical tips that maybe you can give to someone who is just starting to use this and they're like, oh my goodness, there's so much happening. I feel like I'm tuning everything out.
Yeah. My suggestion always is just to pick one thing, like one extra thing to add to what you're doing. So if you're going to pay attention to somebody's rate of speech, for instance, don't worry so much about what the words are that they're choosing. Or if you're going to say like, oh, I'm going to pay attention to their words, don't pay attention to the rate of speech because it's too much, right? Like you're putting too much in your brain because you're also supposed to be talking about what your offer is and all the other stuff that goes into sales. So just pick one thing and get good at it. Because at some point, it will move from your, have you heard of like the 4 levels of competency before?
I have seen it mentioned, but if you can explain that to our listeners, what exactly that is.
So there's 4 levels of competency. Like at the basic level is what's known as your unconscious incompetence. These are those things like I can't even tell you what mine are because I have no awareness around them. You can probably tell me what you'd be better at telling me what mine are than I can tell you what mine are, because it's like you just don't know what you don't know. That's unconscious incompetence. Now, at some point you move up on this scale and you get to conscious incompetence. Now, I can tell you I have a laundry list of things that I am incompetent on. Like for instance, I could never do what you do, Kathy. Like I couldn't look at somebody's finances and paint a picture and create a roadmap for them on how to improve that. That's me being consciously incompetent. Now, the next level up is you get to conscious competence. These are those things that you know how to do them. Maybe you have to think about it a little bit, or like, for instance, if you're cooking a recipe for the first time, you're probably going to follow that recipe pretty like religiously, right? Like you're going to put in the right amount and all the things it says. But after you make that recipe a few times, you might start like, and I'm not even going to look at the recipe. I'm just going to doctor it because I think I know what goes in there. So that conscious competence is where you know what you know, you have to think about it a little bit. Then you move to the highest level, and this is your unconscious competence. These are those things that come so naturally to you that it's almost like breathing. Like whether or not you recognize it, anybody listening right now, your body is breathing, right? Because you wouldn't be listening if you weren't. So you're not having to think about your breath. It's just, you're just doing it. Your body is doing it. It's become unconsciously competent that you can breathe. And there's many things in your life you're unconsciously competent at. These are those things that people often think like, oh my gosh, I think you have a superpower. How do you know to do that? And you kind of think, doesn't everybody? It's kind of easy. That's those unconscious competence. So with these techniques that I'm talking about, the goal is to, 1, move it from unconscious incompetence to now you're consciously incompetent, decide to implement it in some way and move it to conscious competence. And at some point, you'll do it enough times where it will become unconscious for you. You won't have to think about it. It's just how you do, right? Like I get a lot of clients that show up like, Nikki, how do you know to say this? Or how do you know to do this? Yeah. Or like, how do you know to tweak this message or change this phrasing? And a lot of times I think, well, it seems really obvious, but if you'd asked me to do those things 20 years ago before I started studying NLP, I didn't know how to do those things. It feels natural to me now because I've been doing it for so long, but at some point it becomes just my personality, my second nature. And these things that I'm talking about, even though they might feel big and overwhelming, you practice them a little bit and pretty soon it just becomes how you show up in a conversation. Like I can't show up in a conversation and not pay attention to some of these things now. Like I have to think about not paying attention to it because it's so natural for me to pay attention to.
Hey there, and thanks for listening. And before we dive back into this discussion, let me ask you this. Is your growth causing financial headaches? Are sales up but profits aren't matching? And are your financial practices still stuck in entry-level mode, making you stressed because you can't keep up with your growth? If so, sounds like that your finances are in a bit of a jam. But don't worry, it's not you, it's your financial setup. And here is the solution. It's the Next Gen Finance Blueprint by us, Newcastle Finance. It's a CFO-led roadmap that will bring your fuzzy finances into focus. It will give you a clear money picture, and it will create an action plan to fix your issues with a roadmap that makes progress simple and tell you exactly what to do. You will do this, and then this. And we're talking long-term solutions here, not slapping on bandages and hoping for the best. You get a holistic perspective. You need to manage your money wisely from now on, even if you grow to hundreds of millions and beyond. If you're ready to level up your finances, head to newcastle.finance/blueprint and schedule your Next Gen Finance Blueprint. Now back to the show. What was when you first started studying this concept, what was that switch that said, this would help me in my sales career? Because was it that someone said it to you? Like, what was that switch that you said, maybe this is something that I need. I should go down that path?
One of the first big things is I took a storytelling class, and it was in the Redwood Forest. And I took it because one of my mentors and good friends asked me if I wanted to spend the week with her. And my answer was immediate yes, because I absolutely adore this person. I knew I would get huge value. And then she said, oh yeah, and we're going to take a storytelling class in the Redwood Forest. And I was like, okay. Well, it turned out that at this class, the teacher of the storytelling class became my NLP teacher for many years. And she had offered, for those of us who didn't know anything about storytelling, and that was me, she offered at lunchtime, those of us who wanted to stay back during lunch, that she would do some private, like not private because it was in a group, but individual coaching. And so it was my turn, and I got up at the fire, in front of the fire, and I started to tell my story. And she stopped me, and in a really kind way, she said, Nikki, do you know that when you speak, and I'd already been in sales, by the way, for many years and had a lot of success. She said, did you know that when you speak, you smile the whole time? And I was like, yes. Now, I was raised by a misogynist man, and I have 3 brothers, no sisters. And there was a lot of, things that you heard back in those days where it was like, you need to smile as a girl, you need to be quiet, don't raise your voice, be pleasant, be happy. Those were all the messages, right? Constantly. So I learned to get along in my family that I needed to be happy and smile. So I took that into my sales career. So when I would be speaking, and in this case, telling a story, I was smiling the whole time. And when she pointed that out to me and she said, now, what would happen if you just relaxed the muscles in your face and told your story? Now, again, there were other people that were sitting around the fire that had stayed behind on their lunch hour. And so I told it, and then she asked the group, what do you guys think? And they were like, so much more credible. And I was like, what? And that next week, when I was back at work, I gave a presentation and I relaxed the muscles in my face when I was talking about my product and what we delivered. And somebody in the room, and this is no exaggeration, she came up to me afterwards and she said, you are so credible when you speak. And that was it. That was the turning point for me. I went all in and, started studying NLP, became master certified. I have over 200 classroom hours in the years that I was studying it, which is significant compared to most people with the same certification that I have less than maybe 40 hours. I went all in because I was like, somebody noticed a difference in the way I'm presenting.
What did that do to your sales career going forward? I mean, I would think there would almost be like a night and day difference.
it definitely made a difference. Now, I was having success, but I will say I became the top producing rep in North America for one of the largest companies in the world at the time that I was working for. And it has continued to propel, even now, clients that I worked with back in my corporate career still show up and now ask me to train their sales teams on how to sell effectively. Now, of course, this is what my business is, but they could choose anybody from around the world. Like, these people have access to any and every kind of sales training you'd want, but they're like, we want you. So it's just been this tremendous difference in the way that my business has grown and the people that show up and want to actually learn from me. And it was all learning about how to communicate in a way that was more effective.
Yeah. And I don't know if I ever told you this, but one of the reasons why I decided to work with you was because of your NLP experience. Because I knew something about it already. Actually, before Nikki and I started talking, I shared with her that I used to have a career coach like many, many years ago, and they were using some NLP. That was my first, I guess, glimpse of what NLP can do. Mm-hmm. So when I saw, Nikki, that you were doing it, I was like, oh, that's what I need. That's a salesperson that can actually teach me how to use this in the sales conversations. I'm sold.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
When you are training salespeople, like when someone is asking you to train the salespeople, like how does that entail? Because I would think that, this is such a vast field and you can apply it in so many different ways. The program that you have that business owners put their salespeople through, how long does that last? I mean, when you start to see results, does it take a couple months? Like, how does that work even?
Well, it really kind of comes down to how well are people implementing what it is that they're learning. It's not uncommon, I will say, for somebody to hire me and immediately see results like in the next conversation that they have. They're like, oh, I just learned this thing. I took it into my sales conversation and I immediately closed this deal that I was nervous about, or I've never closed on a first-time call with a client before. That happens actually pretty regularly with my clients. So, and then I have other clients that, it's like time release learning. I don't know if you know that term before, but sometimes you'll learn something and you don't implement it right away. And then something will happen and it will give you this recall of like, oh, I remember this. And maybe you go dig a little bit and you maybe read up, or maybe you look back at the workbook and then you put it into practice and it's like, it didn't feel that natural. So maybe you don't do it as much, but then you go back to it again and again. And then pretty soon, I have clients that will show up a year, 2 years later and be like, Nikki, I've just now started implementing pre-framing on the start of my sales calls, and I can't believe the response I'm getting. Or like, Nikki, I've just now learned how to get the I statements out of my emails, and people are responding in a very different way, right? So it does come down to the implementer, of the person who's learning, and are they ready to implement? And usually if I can get somebody to implement one thing immediately as a result of us working together, they will get a result from it. And then they're ready for the next thing, right? It's like, what else do you have now? Like, that worked. What else is there for me?
Yeah, and as you were talking about the I statements, I have become very sensitive to how many I statements I put in emails from now on. And another thing that Nikki taught me is every email needs to start with a question. And for someone who's tries to be very efficient and is very, analytical and finance driven, I generally do not start my emails with "How are you?" But that is what she taught me. And now every single email starts with "How are you?"
Yes, you got to engage the brain of the reader. So by asking them a question, it allows for their brain to want to answer. And there's actually a term for this. It's called instinctive elaboration. When our brains get asked a question, it immediately wants to answer. Like, that's just natural. It's kind of like Google. If you go to Google, you type something in, Google's trying to give you an answer. It doesn't always get it right. And sometimes, you go like, come on, Google, you can do better than this. But when you ask somebody and you start with a question, you immediately engage their brain. Even if they choose not to type the answer and respond, their brain has already started to answer your first question.
Interesting. How about the I statements? I know the way how I think about the I statement is no one really wants to know about you. They're interested about themselves.
Yeah.
So when it comes to I statements, like when you know you're using too many, and is there such a thing as not using enough?
Yes. Yes. I love this question. Okay. So first and foremost, the reason to get your I statements out of your emails, or at least the majority of them, is because we have a thought, we think it, we type it. So we think from our perspective, and then we type and write from our perspective. But the reader who's getting that message from you, they read from their perspective. So if they don't already have a lot of rapport with you, your perspective isn't interesting to them, because most of us think the whole world revolves around us, right? The whole world revolves around me. Everything that happens is happening for me, to me, or against me. And a perfect example of this is if you are headed somewhere and it just happens to be a day where traffic is super heavy, and you're thinking like, what are all these people doing out on the road? Like, it's Saturday. Shouldn't they be like at home enjoying, like, get out of my way? And you're kind of annoyed at all the traffic in front of you. But how often have you thought about there's 20 cars behind you that are annoyed that you're on the road, because to them, you are traffic. But we don't think like that. We just think about what's in our way, what's right. And so it's the same for your prospective clients. They're interested in, how does this benefit me? How is this for me? Is this to me, against me, whatever, right? So getting some of your I statements out, and I statements are things like, I hope you're having a great day. Well, that sounds nice, but actually that doesn't engage the brain, because that's just talking about what you hope. That's not interesting to somebody. So instead, if you say, how's your day going? That's a very different engagement from the reader. So the rule of thumb is, and for anybody who's listening to this and like, I don't know about this, go look at your last 5 emails that you've written to prospective clients, if there's a sales component to your business, or just 5 emails that you've sent to clients, right? And count the number of sentences in that email message. So let's say you count it and you go, there are 10 sentences here. Now count how many times you write an I statement. So I hope this, I want this for you. I, look forward to talking to you, right? And you count them up. Chances are you have more I statements than you do sentences. That's pretty common when I start working with clients. And my suggestion is you follow the 80-20 rule. You want to get 80% of the message should be more you statements to the reader. So it should be for their benefit, either asking them a question and or making a you statement. Like, you can find the information by clicking this link, versus I've attached this link for you to find this information. See the difference? Mm-hmm. So 80-20. So 80% of the message should be you statements. So in that particular case, 10 sentences, 2 I statements is more than plenty. And it takes a little bit of work. I know you and I, we've gone round and round and back and forth about messaging. And sometimes for people, this is hard at first, but it gets easier. And now, right, you have this awareness around it. You start to write differently. You start to ask questions versus making statements, because statements are usually I statements. And you engage people to want to actually respond when you do that. So if you're going to spend the time to send an email to somebody and you actually want to engage with them, then get those I statements out of there. And it's unrealistic to, like, don't walk around patting yourself on the back going like, I wrote a 10 sentence email and there are no I statements in it. I'm not saying like I statements are bad and you should never use them. I'm just saying we should limit them.
And sometimes I'm sneaking in I statements where it's not actually an I statement. I'll give you an example. For example, if I say I wanted to, we can just say wanted to and drop the I. Does that still count as an I statement?
No, it doesn't count. You're like walking the fine line. Like, I will say I end almost every email, because I want people to respond. I end every email with looking forward to your response. Now, I do that for a couple of reasons, and there's very NLP here. One, I take out the I'm looking forward to you responding, right? Because that doesn't sound the same. So looking forward to your response is also an embedded command. This is very NLP. An embedded command which says to them, yeah, I'm expecting a response. but in a nice way. So people are more likely to respond when you have looking forward to your response versus like, let me know what you think. They're not going to let you know because that's not as interesting to them. Looking forward to your response is about them and them doing something. Let me know what you think is about me. Let me know something. That's not interesting to the reader.
That's really interesting. I knew that there were techniques like this, but I didn't know that is why you do that. That's a new thing for me. Okay. Is there anything else that you use that it's almost like an embedded command in a nice way?
Yes. So another embedded command is using the word now in your messaging. So instead of saying like, click the link, I'll say, click the link now. Because now is like, make a decision, right? And our brains are overloaded with decisions. And if we don't have to make one, we oftentimes won't. We'll like postpone it because we have decision fatigue. So if you can make it easy for someone to make a decision, which is essentially saying like, go ahead and do it now versus trying to do it later, they're more likely to do. So now is another like super easy embedded command that you can put in there. The other one is if I'm asking somebody to make a decision, like, you ready to work together or not? I might say, now, based on these three options, which option is the best fit for you right now? Now, notice I didn't emphasize the now, but I said it. Mm-hmm. It's essentially saying, go ahead and pick. Go ahead and make a decision.
How about ending the emails? I know a lot of people put thanks. I use thanks. I use exclamation point, which Nikki and I have gotten back and forth. But I am too generous with my exclamation point.
You love an exclamation point, which I do too. I do. It's just sometimes not, well, again, because I'm thinking about it. Like my job when I work with you is to do everything I can possibly give you, anything and everything I can possibly give you that is going to make a difference in a positive way to your bottom line. Yep. So I, as a sales coach, I actually am not thinking about you. I mean, I am, but I'm mostly thinking about how is this going to be received by the person who's getting this message. So I'm always thinking about them because they're ultimately the person that's going to say yes, pay you money. So my focus is usually on them. And I don't know this person. So I don't know, are they somebody who loves a bunch of exclamation points or are they not? Now I get that Kathy loves exclamation points. And when you send me messages that are just to me, you can riddle it with exclamation points because I love you and I want you to do what feels comfortable. But I don't know what your reader, how they feel about exclamation points. So I'm going to limit them so as to not trigger somebody who's like, is she yelling at me? Right?
Interesting. Yeah. So you think that using exclamation points can actually come out as yelling? I think of it more as coming out as excitement, but that is my assumption.
It can't. Well, see, that's the thing is that we all make assumptions about what they mean. And I'm going to limit as much as possible letting somebody else make an assumption about what you mean by getting some of those out of there. Because some people might take exclamation points as yelling. Some people might take it as like, wow, this person is coming on really strong. Or they might take it as like, why is she so excited? Like, what's going on? You know, it's kind of like if you've ever met somebody who's like a super high energy, and if that's not your style, and you're like, somebody's like, oh my gosh, Kathy, it's so great to see you. I'm so excited to get this time with you. And you might be like, oh, too strong, right? So for the reader with the exclamation points, I don't want them to have the impression that that is the way that you're coming across, because I don't know if they would respond well to that. Now, if your client or prospect sends you back a message and it's riddled with exclamation points, match and mirror. You can send them as many exclamation points or emojis as you want, because that like you're speaking their language now. But until we know what their language is, I want you to set yourself and them up for success to continue the conversation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And going back to that, what would you suggest is a good closing for the email? Best, thanks, regards, looking forward to talk. Like what is your one of the go-tos for you when you're closing an email?
Well, I'll tell you the one that I use, which is kind regards. And the reason I use kind regards is, one, kind is a key word for me personally. Like when I think about, what are my core values in my business, I want to ensure, like the goal is that when people work with me, they go, Nikki is kind and she is credible. So I use kind regards because it fits my language. So I don't necessarily have a specific like, oh, definitely say this or that. It needs to resonate with you because, again, we want to attract the clients that are the right fit. So if somebody is turned off by like, I don't want a kind sales coach, like I want to like beat me down, not, like knock me down 5 times and then help me stand up 6. Like I'm not the kind of coach that knocks people down. Like I'm going to encourage you and I'm going to lift you, but I will never like punch you and knock you to the ground and be like, get better. Like that's just not who I am. And so again, I want to attract people who want a coach that is going to be supportive, is going to say hard things, but is never going to feel like it's a slap or a knockdown. But that doesn't resonate with everybody. Like some people are like, I want a coach who's going to just like pound me and correct me every step of the way. And, essentially like, it's kind of like knock somebody down to build them back up. Like that's just not my style. I'm going to take you where you are and I'm going to continue to build you and refine you and like build you up so that your confidence just continues to grow. Like that's who I am. So that should show in your response. If you think I would never write kind regards, don't. Like it that's okay. Thanks, if thanks is appropriate, or, some people write blessings, right? Like whatever resonates with you, fine.
Yeah. And I want to go back into what you mentioned in in our conversations before. You mentioned pre-framing. Mm-hmm. And I know what pre-framing is, but that is such an important part of every sales conversation that I have now, thanks to you. But for listeners who are not familiar with this concept, can you walk us through what pre-framing is?
Yeah. So pre-framing does come from my background in NLP. So there's a presupposition in NLP that says pre-framing is worth a ton of reframing. So instead of trying to like fix something after it's gone wrong, if you can pre-frame, it sets the stage for success. So the idea of pre-framing at the start of your sales calls, the number one reason that you pre-frame the start of your call, there's multiple reasons, but the number one reason is to create safety for the other person in the conversation. Because even though you might be thinking like, well, I'm the one who feels nervous, why should they feel nervous? But realistically, your prospect could be nervous about talking to you. One, because maybe they're afraid you're just going to hard sell them the whole time. Maybe they don't know what you know and they feel intimidated by you. Like we don't know what's going on for them. So our job is to create safety in the very beginning. And pre-framing sets the stage of what's going to happen. So an example, pre-framing is essentially creating safety and letting the person know, like, what is the point of this call and what's going to happen. Example of a pre-frame at the start of a sales call. And this is what I teach. And of course, you have to adjust it to your particular application. But typically my format that I give people to start is to say something like, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. The purpose of our call is to chat about like what's going on for you and see if what I offer would be a good fit. So that's like getting the purpose out. Then I say, we're scheduled to chat for about X number of minutes. Does that still work for you? Now, the reason you say X number of minutes is because I want to set this person up for success to be focused in the call. If I can have any influence over them being focused in the call, and if they're thinking to themselves, like, how long is she going to be talking for? How long, or like, I got to go, I have a meeting in 25 minutes. It gives them the opportunity to say, I only have 25 minutes, or we need to wrap this up in about 20 minutes. Like whatever that is, because then it like gets that out of the way, the timing. Mm-hmm. So it creates safety for them. So they know you're going to honor their time and the amount of time. It also sets you up for success. So this is not a pick my brain session. We're not going to be on the call for 2 hours just chatting. Like that's not what this is for. So once I get confirmation that time still works for them, then I'm going to ask permission to lead the call. And the way I do that is I say, now in order for this time to be meaningful and productive for you, notice there's no I statement in there. In order for this time to be meaningful and productive for you, is it okay if I start with a couple quick questions? That's me asking permission from you for your benefit for me to lead the sales call. Because if I let the prospect lead the call, like it could go off the rails. It could go like, who knows where it's going to go. And your job is to earn their business. And the way you're going to earn their business is to like follow your process. So pre-framing creates safety for them, and it allows for you to take permission or get permission to lead.
And sometimes this can be challenging in practice, because I have had sales conversation where the prospect tried to wrangle the control over the meeting, and they just went straight into it. And it was interesting, like trying to put it back into the pre-framing situation. So if you ever get into a situation where the prospect just won't go straight into the conversation without any pre-framing from you, like how do you bring that back into, no, this is where we're going to start with the pre-framing?
Yeah. So I might check if I might say, because I don't want to shame them in any way, right? Like I want to be really respectful of them. So I might say, I really appreciate how you came in and you have an agenda. Now, in order, again, because we do have a limited amount of time together, and I want to make sure, or I would say, because we have a limited amount of time together, let's ensure that you get the information that you need. And in order to do that, is it okay if I ask you a couple quick questions? Like I might just come back with like, I'm going to state the reason why I'm asking to change the format a little bit. And again, you're going to have certain people who are like, they don't even hear you because they're not good listeners. They, or they've got their own agenda and they're just going to follow it. And so sometimes you might either decide like, okay, I'm going to let them go for a little bit longer and see where this goes. Or you might go, I can already tell this is not an ideal client for me. And so if that's the case, you're going to bless and release, because there's no point in taking up your time and theirs to essentially say like, we're not a good fit. So in that particular case, if somebody's just like completely, I get a sense like they're not interested in coaching. They're obviously not coachable because they can't even answer a question that I asked them. I might say, I get a sense that who I am and what I offer is not the right fit for you. So I'm just going to respectfully decline continuing this conversation. I really appreciate your time and I wish you well. And then I'm ending the call.
Yeah. I love that. It's very clear. It's very respectful to both parties. And if you don't want to go into a situation where a client is going to be a pain in the ass, because it's not a good situation. Nikki, you have gave us so many good tips and tricks and ideas about the NLP. But if someone is listening to this and they're like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of stuff to implement, I don't even know where to begin. What would you tell them is like the next small actionable step that they can take in the next week or two to start implementing NLP in their business?
Well, to implement NLP in their business, the thing that I would encourage you to practice first and foremost is pay attention to people's rate of speech. You can do this when you're, ordering your coffee at Starbucks. Pay attention to the rate of speech of the person that's talking to you. You can do this with your significant other at home or your kids even. Just start to like build this muscle to just pay attention. And notice I'm saying like pay attention to somebody's rate of speech. I'm not even saying try to match it, right? Just pay attention to their rate of speech. Oh, this person is a fast talker. This person is a slower talker. Like just start to notice, because once you can bring it into your awareness, then you can decide if you want to make any adjustments to yourself. That's my answer about the NLP. But I will say of everything I've shared today, the one thing that will absolutely make a difference to your sales conversations is the pre-framing. So if you take one thing away from this episode about sales, it's that pre-frame. I cannot express enough how important it is to pre-frame the start of your sales calls, to really set the prospect and yourself up for success.
And I can vouch for that as well. Things have started and gotten a lot better with my sales conversations after I started doing the pre-framing. It's been a night and day difference. So Nikki, thank you so much for being out here. Can you please let us know where can our listeners find you?
Well, I'm going to wrap it around a gift, if that's okay for your listeners.
Sure.
So the easiest way for us to get in touch is I have an ebook. It's called Closing the Sale, and it talks about the last 3 steps of my signature framework, which is called the Selling Staircase. But it's about building your confidence in that consult call. So you can get that by going to yoursalesmaven.com/Kathy. So this is for your listeners. So yoursalesmaven.com/Kathy, and then we'll be connected. And so that's the easiest way for us to get in touch. And then obviously you like to listen to podcasts. So you can always check out the Sales Maven podcast as well.
It's a great podcast. I have it on automatic download as well. So I like listening to Nikki.
Thank you.
Nikki, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.